because of either the person himself or herself, or their attitude about things that maybe would rub me the wrong way.
They were not just Hollywood's most famous duo, they were its most whispered about. Frank Sinatra, the powerful white superstar with influence that stretched from Vegas casinos to the White House, and Sammy Davis Jr., the fearless black entertainer who could sing, dance, and charm any room he walked into. Together they broke barriers, defied the rules, and made history on stage. But behind the smiles and standing ovations was a friendship tangled with rumors, politics, power, and moments so tense they nearly destroyed it. And just before Sinatra's death, he said one sentence about Davis that left everyone stunned. A sentence that forced people to rethink everything they thought they knew about the Rat Pack's most complicated bond. It all began in 1941, backstage at the Michigan Theater in Detroit. Frank Sinatra was just starting to taste the kind of fame that could change a man's life. Fronting the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, drawing crowds with his velvet voice, and carrying himself like someone who knew the spotlight would never leave him. Sammy Davis Jr., barely 16, was part of the Will Maston Trio, a hard-working black vaudeville act playing smaller slots on the same bill. During intermission, the two found themselves in the same break room, and in a moment that seemed ordinary but would later feel historic, they split a sandwich and struck up a conversation. For Davis, this was not simply meeting a star. He had been quietly clipping every article about Sinatra for years, keeping them in a notebook he showed to his grandmother. Not because of Frank's fame, but because Davis saw in him something black entertainers were rarely allowed to possess: stage power, the right to speak their mind, and the right to be treated with respect. In 1940s America, theaters, restaurants, and hotels were still divided by color. It was almost unheard of for a white headliner to sit down and share food with a young black performer, especially one still finding his place in the business. But Sinatra did not care about rules like that. He had a reputation even then for doing things his own way, and in that moment he made no speeches and gave no lessons. He simply treated Davis like an equal. Neither of them knew it yet, but this small act of camaraderie, away from the cameras and the crowds, would plant the seed for a friendship that would survive decades of fame, politics, and controversy, and would eventually rewrite the unspoken rules of show business. In the years after that first meeting, Sammy Davis Jr. kept Sinatra in his sights, not as an idol to imitate blindly, but as a blueprint for the kind of artist he wanted to become. He studied everything: the way Sinatra carried himself on stage, the way he dressed, even the way he walked into a room and made people turn their heads. Davis was not trying to copy him. He was trying to learn the mechanics of respect, the unspoken language of power that Sinatra seemed to command effortlessly. When Davis was drafted into the Army in 1944, those lessons became more than theoretical. Stationed in a world still thick with prejudice, Davis endured open hostility, beatings, threats, and constant reminders that to many, his talent meant nothing against the color of his skin. To survive, he leaned on his ability to perform, entertaining soldiers not for money, but to diffuse the hatred that followed him. During those long months, one short film became his personal talisman, The House I Live In. In it, Sinatra delivered a direct, almost defiant message against racial prejudice, a performance that earned an honorary Oscar and carried a weight far beyond its few minutes on screen. To Davis, it felt like Sinatra was speaking directly to him. By the time Davis returned from service, he had sharpened his skills and his ambitions. Back with the Will Maston Trio, he worked the circuits but kept one eye on Sinatra's rise. In 1947, when Sinatra headlined the prestigious Capitol Theater in New York, he could have chosen any warm-up act. Instead, he asked for the Will Maston Trio, and did not stop there. Sinatra demanded they be paid 5 times their usual fee, forcing the venue to treat them like a main attraction rather than a token sideshow. For Davis, it was not just a paycheck. It was an introduction to an audience that had never seen him before, and might not have, without Sinatra's pull. That was the first of many times Sinatra would quietly open doors for Davis, using his influence not with grand gestures or press statements, but with decisive actions that sent a clear message. When Frank wanted something or someone taken seriously, it happened, and Davis knew that if he could stay in Sinatra's orbit, he would have a chance to cross barriers most black entertainers were never even allowed to approach. By the mid-1950s, Las Vegas had become the beating heart of American entertainment, a neon kingdom where careers could be made overnight. For Sammy Davis Jr., it was the stage he needed to conquer to cement himself as more than just a talented novelty act. But Vegas was still a city with two faces, one that welcomed black performers on stage, and another that forced them to sleep, eat, and live far from the glamorous strip they helped fill with music. Davis could headline a casino show, then be told to leave through the kitchen and return to a boarding house miles away because of the color of his skin. Frank Sinatra was not blind to it, and unlike most, he was not willing to play along. When the Sands Hotel booked Sinatra, he made an ultimatum that caught management off guard. If Sammy Davis Jr. was not allowed to stay in the same hotel as the rest of the Rat Pack, the show was off. It was not an idle threat. Sinatra had the kind of box office pull that could make or break a casino's year, and the Sands knew it. Faced with losing their biggest draw, they gave in. Davis checked into a room at the Sands like any other star, and in doing so, walked through a door that had been locked to black entertainers for decades. The impact went beyond one hotel. Other venues took note, policies began to shift, and slowly the idea that Vegas could remain segregated started to crumble. It was not a public protest, and it did not make headlines like a march or a speech. But it was the kind of backroom power move that changed the game. And for Davis, it was a clear reminder that Sinatra was not just a friend. He was a shield in a town where friendship and survival often meant the same thing. By the late 1950s, Sinatra's orbit had become more than a career booster. It was an exclusive club. The Rat Pack was not just a group of performers. It was a cultural force, blending music, comedy, and a kind of swagger that made their Las Vegas shows the hottest ticket in the country. Alongside Sinatra, the core lineup included Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and now Sammy Davis Jr. They turned every performance into an unpredictable party, where the jokes were as sharp as the suits and the drinks flowed as freely as the applause. For Davis, it was the ultimate stage. Not only was he performing to sold-out crowds, but he was sharing the spotlight with the most influential entertainers of the era. But the camaraderie the audience saw was not the whole picture. Davis's talent made him an equal on stage, yet off-stage, the lines of race and power never disappeared entirely. Rat Pack banter often included jabs at Davis's skin color, voice, or height. Nicknames like Smokey or jokes about his appearance delivered in front of thousands. Davis laughed along, firing back with his own lines, because in that environment, silence was not an option. The crowd loved it, the press called it edgy and no holds barred, and the casinos sold it as proof of the group's chemistry. But outside the neon glow of the Strip, the reaction was different. In the African American community, especially among civil rights leaders, some saw Davis's willingness to endure those jokes as a betrayal. He was called an Uncle Tom, accused of bending too far to keep his place in a white-controlled circle. It was a criticism Davis rarely addressed publicly, but privately. It stung. He knew the price of the position he held, and he also knew that in the Rat Pack, one misstep could turn a career-defining opportunity into a closed door he would never reopen. The tension between public laughter and private discomfort would only grow, and in 1959, one moment on a Chicago radio show would push that tension past its breaking point. In 1959, the simmering tension finally boiled over. Sammy Davis Jr. was booked on The Shay Show in Chicago, a casual radio interview that at first stuck to safe topics: career milestones, upcoming gigs, and his admiration for Frank Sinatra. But as the conversation loosened, Davis added something unexpected. He praised Sinatra as a mentor, yes, but also criticized certain moments where Sinatra's behavior, in his view, crossed the line into disrespect. It was not a rant, but in the delicate ecosystem of the Rat Pack, even a mild public critique was a dangerous gamble. Word traveled fast. Within days, Sinatra heard about the interview. The reaction was swift and brutal. Insiders say his call to Davis was laced with insults, some using language so cutting and, according to multiple accounts, racially loaded, that it left no doubt about his fury. The fallout was immediate. Davis was fired from the Rat Pack's upcoming film Never So Few, and every opportunity Sinatra could influence seemed to vanish overnight. For Davis, it was like the lights in Las Vegas going out all at once. The months that followed were a lesson in power. Davis tried every route to mend things: letters of apology, messages passed through mutual friends, even direct approaches to Sinatra himself. Each time he was shut out. Only after Dean Martin intervened and Peter Lawford mediated did Sinatra finally agree to bring Davis back into the fold, just in time for filming Ocean's 11. But the damage was done. their friendship would never return to the easy warmth it once had. Davis later admitted in an interview that he had crossed a line, but he also dropped a revealing comment. "I know who's in charge, and I know where I stand." It was a statement that spoke volumes. In public, they were still the dynamic duo, but behind the curtain, the hierarchy was clear. Sinatra was the gatekeeper, and staying in his good graces was not just about loyalty, it was about survival, in an industry where one man's favor could mean the difference between stardom and silence. The early 1960s brought a new stage for both men, one that went beyond music and movies. Civil rights was no longer a distant political issue. It was front-page news, and both Sinatra and Davis were in positions to make a difference. Sinatra used his influence to organize a benefit concert for Martin Luther King Jr. at Carnegie Hall in 1961, a groundbreaking event that brought mainstream entertainment into the heart of the movement. Davis, now a national star in his own right, performed at rallies and fundraisers, lending his voice and his name to causes that just a decade earlier might have cost him his career. Behind the scenes, they took aim at one of their own strongholds, Las Vegas. The Rat Pack's regular venues were still plagued by segregation in staffing and accommodations. One night at the Sands Hotel, when a black couple was refused entry because of their skin color, Sinatra stopped the show cold. He told management, in no uncertain terms, that either the policy changed immediately or he was gone. The rules changed that night, and Davis did not need a public statement to understand what it meant. He had seen it happen with his own eyes. But activism came with its own political landmines. When John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960, Sinatra pulled Hollywood into the campaign, and Davis was set to perform at the inauguration. Then news broke of Davis's marriage to white actress Mae Britt. In a political calculation aimed at appeasing Southern voters, Kennedy's team quietly cut him from the lineup. The snub crushed Davis. Sinatra never said much publicly, but friends claimed he was furious, and his relationship with the Kennedy White House cooled after that. Even in moments of personal crisis, the quiet loyalty between them surfaced. In 1963, when Sinatra's son Frank Jr. was kidnapped, Davis was one of the first to be by his side. There were no cameras, no press statements, just a steady presence during the search. It was in these private spaces, away from the Rat Pack's lights and the world's expectations, that their friendship showed its most authentic form. Unspoken, but deeply understood. By the late 1980s, time had caught up with the Rat Pack. The sharp suits still looked good under the lights, but the steps were slower, the notes a little softer. In 1987, tragedy struck when Dean Martin's son was killed in a plane crash. Davis was battling laryngeal cancer. Sinatra's health was fading, but they came together with Liza Minnelli for what many called the last true Rat Pack tour. The voices were not what they once were, yet the bond, the unspoken understanding between Sinatra and Davis, was still visible on stage. They stood together until they could not anymore. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. passed away after a fight with cancer, ending a career that had spanned over 60 years. The news hit Sinatra like a blow. He canceled all of his performances for the week and flew straight to California. At the funeral, Sinatra did not sit quietly in the front row.
Mr. Sinatra, we know this is a sad time for everyone right now. How do you think Sammy should be remembered?
Well, from my standpoint, he should be remembered as one of the finest human beings I ever knew in my life.
He served as a pallbearer, carrying his friend one last time. When asked to speak, he did not give a long, polished eulogy. Instead, he said just one line. It's hard to sum up a friendship of more than 40 years in a few words. I wish the world could have known Sammy the way I did. For all the rumors, all the speculation about power, politics, and personal dynamics, that moment stripped everything down to its core. Whatever tensions they had, whatever cracks had formed over the decades, Sinatra had shown up every time it truly mattered. Years later, Davis's daughter would write that her father was always grateful for the doors Sinatra opened for him, even if he had mixed feelings about the cost of walking through them. And Sinatra, who rarely explained himself, never added more to that final statement. Maybe he did not need to. Because in the end, their story was not defined by speeches or public displays. It was written in decades of decisive, often invisible actions. In an industry built on appearances, theirs was a friendship that endured long after the curtain fell. And for Sinatra, that simple sentence at the funeral was all the confirmation he would ever give. The friendship between Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. was never simple. It was built on loyalty and opportunity. but also shaped by the harsh realities of race, power, and the politics of show business. There were moments of deep trust, and moments when the balance tipped so far it nearly broke them. Davis knew Sinatra could be controlling, even ruthless, but he also knew Sinatra was often the one man willing to stand between him and a world that still wanted to keep him in the shadows. And Sinatra, for all his temper and ego, seemed to understand that Davis was not just another member of the Rat Pack. He was proof that talent could cross boundaries the industry swore were immovable. The rumors and speculation will never disappear. Some will say Sinatra included Davis to burnish his own image as a progressive star. Others will argue it was a genuine bond that simply played out under the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. But the truth is likely both, complicated, imperfect, and entirely human. What cannot be denied is that for over 4 decades, in public and in private, Sinatra showed up for Davis when it counted most. And when Davis was gone, Sinatra's final words cut through decades of gossip and left only one lasting impression. Because in the end, what people remember is not the jokes, the feuds, or even the politics. It's the image of 2 men, different in race, background, and power, walking through an era that tried to keep them apart and refusing, in their own way, to let it happen. That's a story worth remembering.
He is probably one of the most honest individuals I've ever met in my life, and I honor his friendship and what he did for me as a performer, and as a person too, because he put my head straight in a lot of areas.
He was a great man. I knew him for years.